Hi, everybody, and welcome back once again to the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. My name is Kostas, and I'm back, as always, with Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Hey, Kostas. It is great to be here today because we have another guest. We have Tim here.
We do. That's two in a row.
Yeah, 2 weeks in a row. And this is another person we know, another friend of ours. And we know him because he has actually participated in our conversational Latin classes for teachers over the past couple years. And so we've had quite a bit of time to get to know him and, know him in the best way, which is the Latin way.
What other way is there?
I don't know any other way, really.
So let me just give the formal introduction here. So, of course, as you said, he is a teacher for Tempe Prep in Arizona and currently teaching this year 7th and 9th grades Latin. And as you mentioned, Andrew, of course, he's a regular attendee of our conversation class and has been now for a couple of years. So everyone, please welcome Tim Enloe to the show. Hi, Tim.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So as Andrew said, you've been coming to our classes now for a couple of years, and we both thought, who better to talk to about conversational Latin and, kind of the impact and the effect that it's had on you and your students than somebody who's actually been in a conversational Latin class like the one we talk about all the time.
So, Tim, we have a few questions. We got a list of questions here. And the first question we had was, how did you get started with conversational Latin? So why did you decide that you wanted to speak Latin in the first place? Did you have any influences who kind of prompted you to look into it? Where did that all begin for you?
Well, I don't know that I had any influences on spoken Latin directly. I do remember in my undergrad program, one of my Greek teachers actually was trying to get us to speak New Testament Greek. He had this whole big program to recover Koine Greek as a spoken language, and
how did that go?
My first. Oh gosh, that's a distance of more than 15 years. I'm remembering that. I think we all liked it. We were starry-eyed sophomores or whatever, but or jaded sophomores, however that goes. But it went pretty well for the short time that he did it. I don't recall that he kept it up over the whole year, so it never really took off. But anyway, that was Greek. I guess that probably planted the seed in my mind of speaking a language rather than just translating it all the time.
That's really interesting.
First time I actually tried it was my first year teaching 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago. Teaching some 7th graders, and I thought, it'd be cool if we could speak it a little bit. I didn't know anything about speaking Latin, so that was an interesting experience that first time.
Yeah, so of course you just said, you hadn't done this before, and Andrew and I talk an awful lot about how, because teachers are not exposed to this from an early starting point, that it's something that a lot of them feel that they can't do, or is too difficult, or is too out of the realm of possibility for them. And something else I mentioned also last time with Andrew and in previous episodes was that when I was learning Latin, I couldn't imagine not speaking it. But I'm curious to see what you thought, Tim, when you were learning Latin. Did the idea of speaking it really ever come to you? Is it something you ever thought about?
Probably not when I was learning it. I had it for 2 years in the undergrad program, and I always found it difficult even to just do the English to Latin sentences on paper. So I don't think I ever thought about speaking it until I started teaching. And I think then it was probably just a way to try to get the kids more interested, because it's a hard sell. Latin's a hard sell to 12-year-olds. It really is.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because there are, I think, some teachers who have the attitude that if they introduce spoken Latin in the classroom, that they'll alienate students. But you think, and I know Kostas and I think as well, that in fact, speaking Latin makes the students more interested in learning the language than they would be. But, I want to hear what you think about that, Tim.
Well, yeah, that was certainly the case in that initial foray that I was telling you about. Even though I had no idea what I was doing, I'd scoured the internet trying to find some kind of resources for spoken. I found some old, like 17th century texts where they had tried to, what was that, Comenius, I think. But it wasn't formatted for use in a modern classroom, so I tried typing up a bunch of that. That didn't work. I couldn't keep up with it. Then I found this old 19th century textbook. I can't remember what it was called, but it was very formal and stylized. Like the English translations would put the verb first, like "have you the salt" and things like that. And
I still talk like that.
I had to reformat. I eventually ran out of time to reformat all of that, and I just, as I said, I really didn't know what I was doing. So that fell by the wayside my first year. But it was an interesting. I think it probably increased the idea that, hey, it should speak Latin. It would be really neat to speak it.
Yeah, and there are not, to your point, Tim, there are not a ton of resources available for conversational Latin, which is one of the main reasons we put out our textbook, which we like to mention here in the advertisements and at the end of the program.
Right, that was a really smooth way of slipping that in, Kostas.
Well, hey, you take it when you can, right?
Right.
Just kind of teed it up for me. Thanks. But no, in all seriously, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, because there just are not a ton of resources. Like you said, Tim, there's a lot of stuff from, pre-20th century and all that. And then there's the Troutman book. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the title of which keeps eluding me.
Sorry, I was going to say, I've looked at that. That's way beyond my level. And I would never be able to adapt that to the levels that I teach. So, that's been it hasn't worked.
Yeah. I mean, let me just jump in there. That was definitely a source for me in the beginning because there just weren't a lot of options. But you can't use that as a textbook. It doesn't work that way. I mean, you can use it as a reference in order to figure out what the Latin idioms are, how things are said, but it's just not an effective textbook. And I think that, that's been a big problem for a lot of Latin teachers. If they just had a textbook that would actually guide them along, then they'd be much more willing to integrate conversational Latin into their curriculum. But it just hasn't existed. And that's why, I created it because I needed it. I mean, when I started to teach conversational Latin, I essentially did it off the top of my head. So we had the classes and I didn't plan what I was going to do that day. I knew where all the students were and I would just gradually move them a little bit farther forward every single time. But then we got to the point where I wasn't teaching all of the conversational Latin classes anymore, and I needed to communicate that curriculum to other teachers. And so kind of an intermediate stage was just this one file that had a semester of curriculum written out for the teachers, and then that eventually turned into the textbook. So it took a little while to actually become what it is today. But it's something that was created because it was a necessity for us if we wanted to do what we do. And, my hope is that it's helpful for other teachers out there.
Yeah, and Andrew, that is, of course, one of the things that we hear a lot from teachers, the ones who are at least interested in doing conversational Latin. A lot of times they'll say, I'd like to, but I have no idea how to begin doing it. I have no idea where to start. And again, that was one of the reasons that, you wrote the book and that we put it out, because we want to help teachers do that. And that was an obstacle that hopefully has been at least diminished. And I would say, I think the obstacle has been removed. through our having put out our textbook to help teachers with that. Okay, so Tim, you then find our classes and you start coming to the classes, and tell me how that experience has been for you, or tell all of our listeners rather. I kind of know because I'm there every other week, but they don't.
Well, I've enjoyed it a great deal. I found the first several months of it, I was having difficulty. Still sometimes do. I somehow, even though I didn't learn to speak it, I somehow got into my mind the classical pronunciations, and so I still think of the W as the V as saying W, and not silencing the H. And so there was sometimes early on when I was not actually understanding what you guys were saying. For instance, like habito, it took me a while to realize that was habito.
Right.
So I just had some practical difficulties at first, but I've really enjoyed it. I found it's definitely increased my own Latin abilities. I've sort of to the point in my classroom speaking where I can often say things now without thinking about it. Very simple things, but still, I'll stop and I realize, hey, I said that without declining the noun or anything, and I got it right. So it's definitely helped me. It's been very enjoyable.
All right, so tell us a little how you've then taken what you've learned in the class and started integrating it into your own teaching. Could you give us a daily class overview of what a normal class is for you and incorporating conversational Latin into it?
Sure. Well, since you were talking about your textbook, and no, you did not bring me on here to talk about your textbook, but I have found it very useful.
You can. That's fine.
I know. I'm just saying this was not set up that way, but it's been useful. I've printed out things from it, various sheets, or sometimes I've used the ones from the archives you guys have. The the visual Latin pages. And typically, I'll pass out something like that and spend the first 10 or 15 minutes, 20 if I can get away with it, just doing the sorts of simple exercises that we do in the classes. First identify all the vocabulary, make sure they know what we're talking about. Sometimes I'll have props, like when we do the table. I've got some plastic forks and knives and spoons that I pass out to each table so they can actually hold the object as they're talking about it. Then I'll just ask simple questions like, do you have that? What is that? What are they? I guess I should be using the Latin, but I've been doing that all day. Can I speak English right now?
That's fine. Yeah.
So I try to do that, 15, 20 minutes of that, depending on the grammar lesson I have to do. My school's pretty tied to a grammar curriculum, and I have to make sure I'm meeting those goals. But
okay.
And then every once in a while, I'll try to work in, if I think about it, I'll ask a question about the grammar lesson in Latin, like something simple, like quid casus est or something. If I'm trying to get them to notice the case of a noun, but that's what I try to do, at least most days.
So you raised a really important point, I think, in what you just said there, and you said, of course, that you have a quota of grammar that you must get done. That the school has told you that you have to do. And this, again, we're sort of listing all of these reasons that we've heard for teachers who don't want to embark on conversational Latin, or they can't, or something is preventing them from doing it. And that is a big, big one. They say, well, I just don't have time to fit it in to the curriculum. There's no way I can do it. But I think you're a good example, Tim, of someone who has things that they have to get done, but who has still managed to incorporate it into your class, if even for, 15 or so minutes, as you said. What are your thoughts on that for teachers who think that it's just not possible for them to integrate it because of mandatory things that have to get done?
Well, I would say there that two other teachers like that, you really have to get over the tyranny of the bureaucracy, so to speak, because depending on what level you're teaching and what sorts of kids you have in your classes, there's going to be a whole lot of them that don't get all the grammar stuff anyway, no matter how much time you put into that. And it's only my second year doing the speaking, but I found last year the speaking 15, 20 minutes a day really did create what I call like a mental circuit in many of the students' minds. They would do very poorly on straight grammar quizzes, but they could speak to me about their pets in Latin and get the verbs and the nouns right. So they were picking up something really organically, the way a language is picked up anyway, even though they couldn't necessarily parse it all out on a quiz or something. So to me, that's a win. I mean, that may not be a win to a principal or somebody looking at the figures on the spreadsheet, but they enjoyed it, and I really think they understood it more. So I think if you can get away with it, teachers, you need to.
Right. And Andrew, I know you have strong feelings about this.
Yeah, my experience has been that, in fact, teaching students conversational Latin improves efficiency. So even though at first you may think that you don't have time, it's just going to get in the way, it's something extra, it'll just be impossible, I found that the students learn the grammar a lot better when they're using Latin in conversation, but much more than that, they learn the vocabulary much, much better when they're conversing in the language. I mean, that is the great advantage of speaking Latin. It is by far the best way to learn vocabulary. And a lot of people don't know that because they've never tried it. They just have no idea that there's this wonderful way of making the students not just learn vocabulary, but retain it very easily, which is very hard to do if you're just memorizing vocabulary lists. I know that Kostas, you agree with me on this because we've talked about this before. I really do not believe in forcing students to memorize vocabulary lists because I found it to be tremendously inefficient. And my attitude always is that we should teach in the most efficient way possible. And part of that efficiency is conversational Latin. So anyway, that's all of it. That's my harangue there.
Not to continually repeat myself, but I have been saying this now for a few weeks in a row, and I figure, well, one more time won't hurt. Not only is it inefficient to try to learn a list of vocabulary for a student, it's impractical. I mean, that's not how language is meant to be taught. And it just doesn't work because that's not how you use a language. No one comes up to a person and asks them to recite a list of vocabulary. When you learn other languages, you converse in the languages. That's how you learn the vocabulary. And why should it be any different for Latin? And, I think.
Well, I'm just going to say what you're saying is that the approach that has dominated in the 20th century is just not effective. And I think a lot of people have this idea that it must be effective because it's the way things have been, the way they've been done for the last several generations. How could that not be effective? But it just isn't. There are real issues with an approach that doesn't use conversation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, what do you think? I mean, imagine if you tried to learn, a modern language like that. I don't think you'd get real far.
Yeah, I generally agree with what you're saying. It's just that, again, myself and I know a lot of other teachers are under the requirement to get through a certain kind of curriculum. My school, for instance, is classics based, and so the kids take Latin from 7th through 10th grade. If they have a choice at 9th grade, they can split off into a modern language if they want, and unfortunately many of them do abandon ship from Latin. But if they go on to Latin in 9th grade, the whole goal of that is to be translating Caesar and Cicero and Virgil in 10th grade. So I've tried it this year. I have 9th graders, so I've tried getting some conversation in there, but I have rapidly found that the sheer amount of grammar I have to cover to get them ready to actually be working with Cicero next year has unfortunately crowded it out on the 9th grade level. But at any rate, that's something that could be changed in the future, I think. I'm always talking to my colleagues about it, trying to get them to, hey, come in and see what we're doing. I feel like if they come in there and see it and hear it, it might make a difference. But I say that, but still, if your goal is reading the classical literature, that I personally don't yet see how I could effectively do the conversation on that level. I'd love to hear from you guys if you know how to do that.
Well, again, yeah, Andrew, this is something that I think we talked about a few episodes ago in learning. I think we were talking about Virgil, actually, and your thoughts on conversation as it pertains to that.
Yeah, so I I really think that no matter who the author is, the big issue that students have across the board is vocabulary. You can teach them the grammar, but it's very hard for them to learn the vocabulary. And if you want them to learn vocabulary, the way to do it is not to give them endless homework where they're just translating. Because what happens, and I can tell you this from my own personal experience as a student, because I did this for many, many years, what they'll do is they'll look up the same word thousands of times and never learn it.
Oh, yes.
Doing that, if they look up a word 10,000 times, they'll probably learn it. But the thing is, if you compare that to conversation, it's ridiculous because a student will probably learn a vocabulary word forever if he or she has used it about 5 times in conversation. That's seriously all it takes, because conversation is so much more effective when it comes to forcing people to learn vocabulary. So if you're really serious about preparing your students to read these texts effectively, then I think that's the approach you should take. I think the issue is that the school system is not really serious about that. That's the problem. They set things up so that students do not have the opportunity to actually learn Latin at a high level. And I think that's what we should be doing. I think we should have curriculum that will allow students to do that. And if you do give them the right curriculum, and the other great thing about conversational Latin is that it's also a lot more fun. And this is something you were alluding to, Tim. Students will be far more likely to stick with Latin and not move over to other languages. But I want to know what other people think about that.
Yeah, well, Andrew, I mean, you certainly know my feelings. We talk about this enough on this show that I'm pretty much in lockstep with you on that. And I gather from much of what Tim has said here today that he agrees with a large part of that as well. Would that be fair, Tim?
Yeah, and as I said, it is a topic of ongoing discussion with my colleagues. They're none of them, like me, none of them were trained in speaking it either, so we're all sort of kicking this around. They like what I'm doing, what they hear about what I'm doing in the 7th grade, but after 7th grade, it kind of falls by the wayside, or, well, it has this year. 8th grade's not doing it. And like I said, now I have 9th, and so far I haven't been able to work it in except for the first couple of weeks. They loved it, though. Oh, man, the first couple of weeks of school, those 9th graders, they were taken right to that. That was the coolest thing in the world to them, speaking Latin.
Okay, so right now we're just going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk to Tim a little bit more about how conversational Latin has helped him with his own Latin abilities, and we'll talk more about his students' own reaction to conversational Latin. So we'll be right back right after this. We know that many Latin teachers out there would like to learn to speak the Latin language and to be trained in teaching conversational Latin, but they just haven't had the opportunity to develop these skills. If this describes you, please consider attending the Gray Fox Conversational Latin Workshop. These classes are open to all current, former, or prospective Latin teachers and are held live online through Skype. We even provide professional development credits for all attendees. The workshop classes are held weekly and are an hour long. Teachers can start at any time. For more information on class times or to register for our Conversational Latin Workshop, please email us at info@grayfoxtutors.com. That's info@grayfoxtutors.com. We hope to see you there. Okay, we're back with our guest, Tim Enloe. And Tim, right before the break, you actually said something that I want to jump back to. You said your colleagues have been hearing about what you've been doing. So, what's their opinion of conversational Latin?
Well, just none of them have actually been in the classroom yet. Like I said, they're just hearing reports, but they are generally supportive of the fact that the kids are engaging it more. That's what I keep telling them over and over again, is that for the most part, the kids are actually paying more attention when we're speaking Latin than they would be if I was just doing a rote grammar lesson, or, okay, let's conjugate this verb on the board, for the 18th time this week or whatever. But yeah, I think my colleagues generally like it. We've not really talked through whether we could adopt it, and adapt it to our overall program. That meeting has yet to take place. We're all very, very busy, as you might imagine. But yeah, they're generally supportive.
And Andrew, I know we wanted to talk to Tim a little more about how conversational Latin has improved his own abilities.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious what you have to say about that, Tim. I mean, do you feel stronger with Latin than you were before since you've been speaking it?
Oh, definitely. It's been I feel like we're still at a fairly low level in the classes. It's only my second year doing it, and that's great. I'm always pressing, hey, let's get more subjunctives. But I'll find myself driving to work and composing Latin sentences in my mind without thinking through all of the endings like I used to have to. So, I mean, I've got a long way to go still, but it has definitely increased my ability to quickly put something together in Latin. Yeah, so.
Right. So, clearly speaking the language is a different beast from translating it, right?
Definitely.
Did you say that, Tim? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's been the hardest hurdle for me is, I don't know if I should say it this way, but I feel like I almost have to get rid of some of the things I learned as a translator. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. Maybe that's not the right way to say that, but maybe you know what I'm talking about.
No, I think what you're...
think differently. You have to think differently.
Exactly. I was going to say, I thought what you were alluding to, and again, this is something Andrew and I have said many times, it sort of requires you to retrain your brain and use, let's say, a different part of your brain than you otherwise normally would.
Maybe even to some extent not think so much about it, if that's, maybe that's a way to put it. Right. Don't try to parse out all the verbs.
And the thing is, when you're doing translating, translating and conversation don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that's the thing too. And when you learn conversation, again, Tim, as I'm sure you can attest to, we try to mix up the word order of sentences. So we don't want anyone to have the idea that, conversational Latin is some sort of a takeoff of English word order or anything. It's not like that. Latin, of course, is its own beautiful thing, and you have to treat it the way the Romans treated it. And of course, word order is something that is very difficult for people when they're first learning to speak Latin, to conquer that urge. And I fight with this constantly as well. You have to conquer the urge to use that English word order. And so we like to vary up the example sentences or the questions that we ask, and we put the verbs in different places or the subjects in different places. And that also is something that's very broadening to a student. When the student can not only hear it that way, but also practice it that way, then that's only going to help them that much more when they see a sentence on paper that they have to translate like that, where the word order is not what you would expect in English.
Well, no, I want to respond to what Tim said about how you need to learn not to think about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So I hear again and again teachers and students saying, well, it's not important to speak it because the goal is to read the classics. Well, that's wonderful, but there's a big difference between reading the classics at, 15 50 words an hour and reading the classics at 30 pages an hour. And if you have to think about what you're doing, it goes very, very slowly. And I also don't think it's a terribly enjoyable experience. And I also don't think that you really experience the text in the way that it's meant to be experienced. You shouldn't be translating it. You should just be understanding it. And I really think to get to that point, people have to use the language as a real living language. It's the only way to get there. They have to be able to converse in the language quite easily before they can really appreciate Horace, for example. Otherwise, Horace hasn't written poetry. He's written kind of a long math problem. And, and that may be fine, but I don't think that's what it was meant to be. And I think most Latin students are stuck in that box, and there's no reason that they need to be there. And Tim, you're talking about how difficult it is to keep students interested in the language and then keep them in the program. Kostas and I have talked about this before, that the reality is at any school, the languages are all in competition with each other. Would you agree with that, Tim?
Oh, yes, quite.
Right. And so there's this situation where all the different language teachers are competing, trying to get the students over to their language. And the most popular language I found is always the language with the best teacher. The teacher who's not only able to teach the language better, but is able to inspire the students better. And if we're really serious about moving students over to Latin and keeping them there, then we have to teach the language in a way that's not just effective. And I do think that that's, in fact, very important to students. They want to actually do well. That's something they respond to in a big way. But also, they want to enjoy it. And the thing that allows them to enjoy it is making the language a living language, not a dead language. But Tim, at your school, what languages are taught? What's available there?
Well, there's, of course, Latin, Greek, Spanish, French, and German. And the way our program is set up, they take Latin 7th and 8th, and then they have a choice at 9th. They can either go into one of the modern languages and then do that for the remaining 4 years, or they can continue with Latin into Latin 3, Latin 4, and if they do that, then they get Greek 1 and Greek 2 in 11th and 12th grade.
Mm-hmm. And what's the general student attitude toward this? Maybe there is no attitude. Is there a reason why students move from one language to another language? Is there a reason why they move from Latin to other languages? Do you have any idea why students do that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not been able to speak to any of my former students about that particular question. Well, this was the first year that I've been at that school that I would have had some students leave Latin. I've talked to a couple of them, just asked them what they're doing now, and they're like, "Oh, I'm doing French or I'm doing German," but I've not really been able to sit down with them and say, "So why did you switch?" I'm not sure, but my general impression from 10 years of teaching Latin on these levels, and I'm not speaking about my school in particular now, but from 10 years of teaching on these levels, is that most kids just get sick and tired of it. They do start to feel like, as you said a minute ago, it's just a long math problem, and they already have a math class, so why do they want to do another one? I'm not speaking about my particular school now. That's just my general impression of students between 7th and 10th grade or so.
Right. Well, and we never would want to put down math. Math is great. Math is important. But I don't think that Latin is math.
Right. They're distinct, is what we're saying. They're two different things.
And I'm glad you said that, Tim, because that's my feeling as well. That it's just very difficult for students to succeed in the language, considering the way it's normally taught. And when I say succeed, by that I don't just mean getting good grades. I mean actually learning it. And I think this is actually a problem we have in America. We're not serious about teaching languages. Now, this is a more general problem. But whether it's Latin or it's Greek or it's German or it's French or it's Spanish, whatever it is, we don't really care about languages. And even though we force students to take these languages, I don't see a lot of students actually learning them. But if they did, they would have a totally different attitude toward the language classes they're in, and whatever that language is, they'd have a different feeling about the value of the language. If you present students with something and you essentially say, okay, you got to go through the motions, but in the end it's meaningless. Well, how do you think they're going to react to that?
What's the point? Yeah, and, let's think about this too from the author's perspective for a minute here. We're talking about readings and authors and all that. I think it would be safe to say that all of these tremendous Latin authors who wrote all these works, and you can include other authors as well, but since we're talking specifically about Latin here, they want the work to be appreciated. They want whoever's reading it or hearing it to have a full appreciation and a full understanding of whatever it is they wrote. And I don't know how you do that without knowing the full scope of a language. And to me, the full scope of a language has to include speaking it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, that aside, it's just cool for kids to be able to speak Latin. It's a really cool thing. Yeah. And when you give them the ability to do that, I mean, you've seen this, Tim. They are extremely responsive. I know that students we've had almost 100% of the time say that the conversational Latin class is their favorite part of our course. It's what they like the most, and they always say, I like it so much because I'm talking about real things in Latin. I'm talking about my life in Latin. They like it because it's alive. And Tim, this is, I think, kind of what you were saying, that the students were really excited about using the language in this way. I mean, is that a reaction you've seen most of the time, some of the time, just a few students? What's your experience of that?
Well, this being the second year I've done it in the classroom, I would say, so we're talking 140 students over last year plus the start of this year. I would say most of them have taken to it fairly enthusiastically. There's always some that are like, meh, whatever, but that's true of any subject. Probably most of my students have taken to it. And last year, oh my goodness, the pets. When we got to the animals, I could have done that the rest of the year, just talked about their dogs and cats and fish every day, and they would have been just fine with that. They loved that so much. Some of them like the vegetables too. I was using like I said, the visual vocab sheets for a while.
Right. Well, I mean, I'll tell you what I remember about being in school. I remember mostly being bored. I remember being bored all the time. Now, it wasn't the end of the world. At a very young age, I reconciled myself to this. It was clear that this was life. This is what I had to do. I had to jump through these hoops. It was never going to be fun. I was never going to enjoy it. It wasn't until I got to high school that I had a few classes I remember enjoying, but 90% of it was still dull. It was just a slog. It was just getting through it. But the teacher who decides to go that extra step to really make the subject interesting for the students, and of course, it'll depend on the subject what you do. But if we're talking about Latin, I think there's no question that the best way to make the subject interesting for students is to have the students speak it. And Latin teachers have the opportunity to teach the fun class. They can do that. If they want to make it happen, they can be the fun teacher. They can be the teacher the students actually really like, rather than the teacher who's just, showing them what they need to know in order to move on to the next step and, learn the next joyless thing that they have to learn. I mean, and hey, maybe other people's experiences have been totally different from mine, but I have a feeling that that's pretty typical.
Yeah, and they can be heroes. Who doesn't want to be a hero?
You're my hero, Kostas.
See, it takes getting a guest on the show for him to start expressing platitudes. But no, Tim, I think what you've said is that the reaction most of your students have had has been pretty overwhelmingly positive for the most part. And talk a little, if you would, about how that positive reception has or hasn't, depending on what has occurred. How has that affected their performance?
Well, I was thinking about that in the wake of last year, because last year I not only did the speaking, but I also was using as a supplementary text Orberg's Lingua Latina, which is just about my favorite Latin storybook of all. So I find it a little difficult to, even now, to separate what roles the speaking had next to the Orberg last year, as far as which one maybe affected their performance more. Maybe it was both together, because with Orberg, at least, they were learning a ton of words. And of course, it was all printed. It was reading. But then I would also try to speak some of that with them on, I'm sorry to have to say I was using vocab lists. Now that you mentioned the problem with vocab lists, I don't like them. I don't like them either, but I was using them last year with the Orberg, and I would try to work in some of those words into the speaking routines. I think overall it did help. I just can't give you like a pure judgment right now on how the speaking has affected. If you understand what I'm saying, because I was doing a dual thing last year. This year I'm not using Orberg. I'm just using the speaking plus our grammar textbook. So ask me again at the end of this year. I can probably tell you how the speaking has affected it straight up.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Orberg's Lingua Latina, because for me, that was a really important stepping stone. I got to conversational Latin totally on my own. And Orberg was great because reading through it, I was able to quite easily pick up a lot of idioms that I really needed to know, that you don't necessarily learn when you're just translating texts. And that helped me a lot in creating my own curriculum for conversational Latin. So, I mean, I would totally advise any teacher you can use in the classroom, and I think it's especially good for younger students, Orberg. But I also think it's great for teachers who really want to understand Latin a lot better. Just get Orberg and read it, and you'll be amazed at the number of things you learn. And a lot of these things may be things you kind of know, but Orberg presents things so that you now are certain, that's how that works. That's how that idiom is. This is, how it's going to look in a short sentence, in a conversational sentence. So, I would say that teachers should really check that out just for themselves. But I'm curious to hear back from you at the end of the year, Tim. And
well, I can mention real quick two things that I know the speaking did for last year's students. Now that I'm thinking about it, and that was duo and trace. They got that down solid in a way that they never would have had I just given them the declension and had them run some exercises, right? And also habeo and habito, which are two of the most frequently confused verbs in 7th grade Latin. I think they got those down too, without confusing them anymore. So both small things, but I would definitely say those were victories as far as comprehension and enjoyment goes.
And it's my bet that by the end of the year, Tim, I think that the improvements and the strides that your students will have made after more conversational Latin like this will be visibly discernible, and there'll be a pretty pronounced effect that it will have had.
I have had parents express concern, and then I have to talk them out of it, and then they laugh. Well, my kid's at home texting in Latin. What's that about? They're speaking it at the dinner table. What am I supposed to do? So it has been somewhat infectious for the kids, and that's definitely a good thing.
Well, that's a great question. What do you tell a parent who may be concerned their student, or their son or their daughter is speaking Latin?
Yeah. Well, I just laughed it off and said, hey, I'm not teaching them anything more than just how to say, hi, how are you? I'm doing well. My birthday is on January 31st or whatever. Just simple, innocuous phrases like that. And usually they're like, oh, whew. So,
I guess they're afraid of being talked about behind their backs.
Probably. What do they say about me in Latin?
Or maybe they think their children are possessed.
Yeah.
One of those.
Always a possibility.
Right. But they are possessed by their love of the Latin language, which is what we want.
Well, they could be using bad English on their text, and instead they're using Latin. So that's a win.
Yeah. That's it.
I agree.
Okay.
And I'm really happy to hear that the students are using conversational Latin outside of class. And I just want to say, as a last comment, that should be our goal. Our goal should be to get students conversing in Latin as much as possible, because the more they do it, the better they'll get, and the better their knowledge of the language will be. But sorry to butt in. Kostas, you were going to wrap things up here.
Just to underscore that really quickly, conversational Latin doesn't have to end when the class ends. And Tim, you were saying that you were composing Latin sentences in your mind when you were driving to work, and that's perfect. And, you have just, skyrocketed in your own abilities, and I can attest to that from, as I said, teaching the class every other week. You do a tremendous job. I think you've learned a whole lot, and it shows, and it's had a great effect on you.
Well, thanks. So, I'm just glad. I just thank you guys again for providing the service. I mean, I know that you don't have to do that, or you could be charging insane amounts of money for your services like most tutors do. So I hope I'm allowed to say that, since you're giving it away free right now. But anyway, it's been a great blessing to me. So thank you both.
We are happy to oblige.
Yeah, no problem.
And we're just about out of time for today. But Tim, we want to thank you tremendously for coming on the show here today. It's been great talking to you about this and getting your insights, the insights of a teacher who's actually been in a conversation class and who is using conversational Latin in the real world. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, and for all of you out there, if you like what you've heard today, and if you've heard any of our other episodes and you have not already, we ask you to please subscribe to our podcast. And also, please check out our Gray Fox website. It was mentioned a few times in today's show. The Gray Fox Archives, which can be found at archives.greyfoxtutors.com. And that's Gray spelled with an E, G-R-E-Y. So archives.greyfoxtutors.com. And in the archives, you can find these visual vocab sheets that we talked about, as well as get our free conversational Latin textbook, which we also talked about extensively. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us here, you can email us at podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. That's podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. And if you're listening to us on YouTube, please click the subscribe button and then the bell up in the corner so that you'll always get a notification when we have a new podcast episode up. So, well, with that said, Andrew, it's been great speaking to you today as well.
Yeah, it was great speaking to you and to Tim both.
Yeah. And again, thank you to Tim Enloe for being on the show. And we will see you next time for the next episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Valete, everybody.
Valete.
Valete.